Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream, and this morning you're joining me looking at some of the models available right now of classic diesel shunters to be used on the British Railway network. Now, this is a fantastic way to get a really highly detailed model onto your layout in quite a small space in any scale too. We have models right now from N gauge up to O gauge with double O in the middle there of many of the different classes that were seen across the UK's rail network, from some of the big important main British rail design locomotives such as the Class 08 shunters that we see here, right through to some more of the more unusual industrial style locomotives which still have their place on your layout too. So I thought to give you a bit of a run through today of all the major shunting locomotive types that are available in model form, as well as a few of the obscure ones too, to just show that sometimes you can pick up something that you may not have been expecting. Now I'm going to go through the types that got the TOPS classification. So we're running from Class 01 to Class 13, and then we'll look at some of the locomotives that didn't quite make that classification, or were just trialled on the British Railway network, but you can still pick up some fantastic models too. If you'd like to see more, as always, don't hesitate to click the link in the description there, where there's more information on all of the models that I'm showing you today. Let's get started at the top then. Let's start at Class 01. Now, these were shunters introduced in the mid-1950s, built by Andrew Barclay in Scotland. There wasn't many of these. I believe there was 6 of these shunters in total. Very small locomotives with a very small wheelbase, designed for use on dockyards and other small industries too. The last 2 locomotives that you can see here actually last operated on the breakwater in North Wales at Holyhead, and they survived right through to the 1970s. As far as I'm aware, there has never been a ready-to-run version of the Class 01s made in any scale. You can pick up kits from a few different manufacturers. I believe there is an N gauge and a double O gauge kit out there from Judith Edge Kits, if you do want to have a bit of a look at that. But if you are looking for a Class 01 at the moment, they are a little bit trickier to find, but sometimes we do get kit-built models through on our pre-owned listings. So a little bit more of the obscure locomotive there, but still a great opportunity to add one to your layout. Heading up, of course, next we stop at Class 02. This was the designation for the Yorkshire Engine Company built 040 locomotives, very similar size to the Andrew Barclay locomotive that we saw there previously. What you see here is the CAD for the brand new Helgen model, which is being released in 2021 and 2022. This model is coming through in double O gauge and N gauge, and it is the first time that a ready-to-run version of the Class 02 has been made available. So this is a great way to get one of these shunters onto your layout. Quite an unusual look compared to most of the UK shunting fleet. You've got the balcony on the back there, or shall we say the veranda almost, with the handrails. This is more in common with US switching locomotives than the UK diesel shunting designs. But these saw service across the north, across the northwest and northeast of England, some of them getting down into the Midlands there too, carrying the British Rail green and British Rail blue colour schemes that, of course, you can pre-order in both of those scales now. So heading up, we're getting a little bit of an upgrade in size now. We're going from the 4-wheel formation up to the 060 6-coupled wheel formation. Our next stop, as I'm sure you can guess with the numbers, is Class 03. Hundreds of these, I believe around 250 of these locomotives off the top of my head, were built by Drury and British Rail. These were engined with a Gardner power unit, similar to a lot of the shunters that we are looking at today. These came into service from the mid-1950s onwards, replacing some of the Class 04s, which we'll be looking at very shortly. These locomotives survived right through to the late 1980s in general service. There was a very small number of them kept for use on certain lines, such as the Isle of Wight railway network, into the 1990s and the early 2000s, but there are many of these locomotives in preservation too. The sheer number of liveries we can look at here, including the BR Green, one of the earliest liveries carried by these locomotives, right through the BR Blue colour schemes there, some of the other sectorization color schemes, including the one-off network southeast color that we can see here on this particular model. Good news for you O3 fans is there are so many models available, great detail models of the Class 03 Shunter. In Engage, you have the Graham Farish model, which is released in many different liveries, including some of the industrial colour schemes. Heading over to double O gauge, we initially had the mainline railways model brought in the 1980s, and you can still find those on our website for some great bargain prices. Heading up in detail, we got a brand new model from Bachmann in about 10 years ago now. I believe this model first came out. Fully digital ready. You've got some working lights in there too. 6-pin decoder socket, powerful coreless motor, and of course space for a sound speaker in there too. That's been produced in a variety of liveries, and again, if you're looking for one of those, do head over to our pre-owned department where we have a good selection of those generally available. Heading up to the big scale, we're heading up to O gauge, and Helgen within the last few years have released their own model, which we've just seen on the screen, of the Class 03-2 that we see here. This coming in several deliveries carried by the class, including the BR green, BR blue, and some of the colours that you see on our listings there too. You're absolutely spot on there, King Ori. Mainline did do an 03. It was the first ready-to-run model of the Class 03 Shunter. I've not got an image here to hand, unfortunately. It's not something I prepared before the stream, so I do apologise. If you want to check one out, we've no doubt got one on our pre-owned section right now. For the time, they were a fantastic model, and even compared to today's models, they really still hold up when it comes to the detail. So do have a look at one of them there. It's a great way to get a bargain double O gauge shunter if you are looking at some pre-owned locomotives. We're heading over to the very similar Class 04 locomotives. These actually predated the Class 03s, an earlier version of the same design with some slight physical and mechanical differences. We can see here one of these in the earlier livery that they carried, the British Railways black colour scheme from the early 1950s, based mainly in the east of England and the south of England. Both the 04 and the 03 were based on locomotives built by Drury, who had built very similar but smaller locomotives as part of their War Department fleet. So these locomotives coming through in 00 and various other scales too. You can check out the 04 now. We have various models again that do come up from time to time on our pre-owned department. The Engage model that we see here is a previous release by Graham Farish, again with fully detailed parts there, including separate handrails and a cab interior. For the 00 model of this, you are looking at Bachmann's range. They haven't released it for a few years in their catalogue, but the 04 can be picked up in our pre-owned section from time to time there too. So we've got up to the 04. Just to clarify there, on the Helgen 02, this is a model that's forthcoming, as we said there, in 00 and O gauge. As far as we're aware, there's not an Engage version of the 02 Shunter as so far. But I'll make sure to mention the Engage Shunters that you can pick up as we look at the different classes throughout the stream today. Next up, we're going up one more number again. We're looking at the 05 Diesel Shunters. These, again, a slightly larger version. These built by Hunslet. There was lots of different builders building different designs of shunters during the 1950s, with pretty much every major locomotive builder having a go at supplying these locomotives to British Rail. The 05 was probably one of the least successful, really. They had a very complicated gearbox arrangement in the cab, making them quite hard to drive. And although they did prove quite reliable with the very large cab there, allowing for great visibility, they didn't really survive on the UK's rail network beyond the late 1960s. One locomotive was transferred to the Isle of Wight, where it is still today, and several of them survive in preservation. But otherwise, you're looking really at the BR green colour scheme for the Class 05 that we see here. These again share the same power unit, the Gardner 8L3 power unit, as you would find in the Class 03 and Class 04 that we've just had a look at. As for models on the screen at the moment, we're featuring Helgen's Class 05 in 00 gauge. This is a model that came out around 2 or 3 years ago now, and there are still some models of that locomotive available to buy new, as well as further models on our pre-owned listings. We have the O-gauge variation, also made by Helgen, in different colour schemes, including some of the post-British Rail industrial colour schemes when these locomotives were sold off into their industrial use too. So some great liveries you can pick up there. King Gory's mentioning some in the chat, as he mentioned there. One of them sold off to the Bulmers cider plant down in Buckinghamshire and running as the Cider Queen locomotive, as it was renamed. You can pick up that model in double O gauge in that distinctive light green livery there too. Heading over to the 06, our next stop, this is a return for Andrew Barclay. They, of course, made the Class 01 locomotive that we looked at right at the start of today's stream. And this was a larger design built for British Rail, used entirely in Scotland in most of their lives. This locomotive, introduced again in the late 1950s. So we saw these come through the BR Black, BR Green, and finally the BR Blue colour schemes that we see here. If you're modelling a Scottish layout from these eras, 1960s, 1970s, you really do need an 06 shunter. There was quite a few of them running around in this area. Very similar body style, but slightly larger there than the Class 01. And this is the Hornby model that we see here that's been in Hornby's catalogue for quite some time now. It is part of the railroad range. So as you can see, it's not quite got the same level of detail as the other shunters that we are looking at today. But the trade-off there is you can pick this up for a fantastic price. It's been made in far more liveries than the real-life locomotives ever carried. You can pick up some unusual British Rail liveries and some industrial liveries on this locomotive, of course, as well as the classic BR Green and BR Blue liveries out there too. As far as I'm aware at the moment, there are no ready-to-run models of the Class 06, whether we're looking down in N-gauge or up in O-gauge, but there are kits out there if you have a look online and you do fancy building up a kit of the Class 06 locomotive. If you're modelling a Scottish layout, that is something you can do. So heading right up from Scotland, we're going all the way to the south coast now. We're going across the country, well, up and down the country, shall we say, heading to the docks at Southampton on the southern region of British Railways, looking at the Class 07. This was a locomotive based on a design already being produced for the British Army by Ruston and Hornsby. This became the Class 07 diesel shunter. So we're working our way up through the list here now. We've got from 01 to 07. And these locomotives were provided purely to work on the docks on the southern region's railways. Very, very small wheelbase on these 6-coupled locomotives allowed them to work on some of the tight curves and other parts of the Southern Railway network that needed locomotives that could go pretty much anywhere. You've got the full visibility there from that higher cab, and also on some of the locomotives you'll see the connection pipes on the front for hooking up to and controlling the brakes on a lot of the Southern region's passenger coaches and electric multiple units too. This model, of course, is the Helgen double O gauge model. It's been around now, a fully new tool model, about 3 or 4 years. We can see some of the distinctive liveries that this has been produced in, from the BR Green to the BR Blue, and also, again, some of those liveries that covered the shunters once they were sold from British Rail use in the 1970s, being used by a lot of other industrial companies. We can see here the private hire Harry Needle locomotive that we have in front of us, and this would have appeared in this livery in the 2000s. So you don't need to pick up one of these locomotives in the British Rail liveries. Many of them, following their useful lives with British Rail, were sold off for private ownership and private use too. So some more of the classic designs out there really are worth a look. So one more than 07. We can't not do a feature today on classic diesel shunters without looking at the main, pretty much the main diesel shunter used by British Rail, the Class 08. There was almost 1,000 of these locomotives built by British Rail over a 15-year period, used all across the British Rail network. Some of them were sold abroad, some of them were sold into industrial use too. Many of them still in use after 60 plus years, with a lot of the private operators that we see. As mentioned there by Thomas, these locomotives are still going strong across the UK's network. Very, very reliable design, and definitely the backbone of the British Rail shunting fleet. These have carried pretty much every UK livery you can think of, going from the BR Black on the initial models that were introduced in the early 1950s, through the BR Greens, the BR Blues that we see here on the screen, pretty much every subsector of British Rail in the 1980s, and a lot of the private operators too, including EWS that you see here, DB Schenker, Direct Rail Services, Freightliner. I could do a whole stream listing liveries of the Class 08. It really is worth a look. You can pick one up in pretty much any colour. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, with the popularity and the sheer numbers of the Class 08, there's been so many models available in a lot of the different scales. Lima, Minitrix, and Graham Farish have produced models in N-gauge. The latest Graham Farish model is a highly detailed model with the separately fitted connecting rods there. And this again is available in our pre-owned section from time to time in a lot of the classic liveries from the 1950s right through to the early 2000s. Looking at 00 gauge models, there was a model on the market pretty much as soon as the Class 08 entered service, with Triang introducing their model. Hornby 00 introduced a model in the 1960s too. We had further models come through in the 1970s and 1980s from the likes of Wren that we see here on this classic locomotive. Lima too, bringing their own model of the Class 08 Shunter in the late 1970s. And these classic models do appear regularly on our pre-owned department. They're not quite as detailed, but they still run very well, and it's a great way to get a cheap Class 08 onto your collection. Of course, if you want something with a little bit more detail in 00, models from Hornby and Bachmann are available to order and pre-order right now. The Hornby model that we see here is available in many liveries in the 2020 and 2021 ranges, including the Cornish Kerno flag livery and British Rail Blue with TTS digital sound. This model comes with an 8-pin digital socket and lots of separately fitted details, as we can see on the screen. And another scale that we've not mentioned there today, but has come up in the chat, thank you very much, Kingori. We have, of course, the TT gauge, which is 1:100 scale. There was very few locomotives made in this scale in the 1960s. But the Triang TT range did see a model of the Class 08 Shunter, again, just showing how important a design these are. Heading up, we have several different, shall we say, flavors of the Class 08 now, were very similar looking locomotives, but all with their own individual histories. Some of the Class 08s were either built or rebuilt as higher speed locomotives, being capable of 27 miles an hour rather than the 18 to 19 of the standard Class 08. These were built to work mainly on the southern region, but they'd also appeared on the Midland region of British Rail too. These were known as the Class 09, and these are covered by exactly the same models. There was very few, if any, external differences on these locomotives. So the models that we mentioned before for the Class 08 also cover the Class 09 diesel shunters there too. One more step up and we're going to the 10. Now, again, something very similar to the look of the Class 08 shunters. There's some minor differences on the panelling on the sides of the locomotives. These were essentially a Class 08, but instead of the English electric power unit fitted to these locomotives, they had a Blackstone power unit, which eventually became the Merleys Blackstone power unit. So although they looked very similar to the Class 08 Shunter, they did have quite a different sound to the 6-cylinder diesel power unit included in the Class 08s and 09s. These, as you can imagine, did perform many of the same duties as the Class 08s and 09s from their introduction in the mid to late 1950s. There was around 150 of the Class 10s built, but with them being non-standard compared to the almost 1,000 of the Class 08s, these were quite quickly withdrawn from service and survived only into the early 1970s. As far as I'm aware, there's never been a model produced of the Class 10 in ready to run in any scale, But for those of you who do fancy a little bit of work, a little bit of modification, it wouldn't be the hardest job to modify a Class 08 model into the Class 10 as we see here. And if you really want to go for the full detail there, you can, of course, record one of the preserved examples of this locomotive, as we see here on the screen, and add that distinctive Blackstone sound to the locos. We're moving on to the Class 11 now. This is an earlier version of the Class 08, which itself is a development of shunters built for the London Midland Scottish Railway right through the 1930s and the 1940s. The final development of these being the Class 08 that we see here. One of the earlier developments brought in from the LMS days was the Class 11. Again, a very similar body style to the Class 08 with some minor cosmetic differences. Otherwise, again, they are pretty much the same locomotive. However, a fully new tooled version of this locomotive is being provided by Model Rail magazine, who are working in partnership with Helgen to bring in a Class 11 for the first time in 00 gauge. So if you are looking for one of those locomotives that was built late 1940s, early 1950s, you can get the pre-grouping LMS livery on there too, as well as the British Rail colour schemes that we all know and love. If you want to head over to Model Rail's website, you can take a closer look at that there. As well as the LMS Railway, the Southern Railway was also experimenting with very similar shunter designs as we see here, and their design became the Class 12 diesel shunter. Again, a very similar body shell and style to the Class 08 that we see here, but this time they were fitted with what's known as box-pock wheels. These were bully design wheels on the locomotives. Rather than having the open spokes that we can see on the Class 08 there, these had wheels in the style of the bullied locomotives that were appearing on the Southern Railway at the time. Mainly built by British Railways, although a small batch of them were built pre-nationalisation, the 12s suffered the same problem that the 11s and the 10s did. Compared to the thousands of 08s running across the network, well, almost 1,000, shall we say, these were non-standard. Although they had a lot of the same parts, they did still have their own individual pieces too, so they were gone very early indeed. Now, I'm not aware of a model of the 12 coming through. I believe there's some proposals out there for the Class 12, but that may be something we see in the future. I really look forward to doing a video on the Class 12 shunters in the future there. Heading up to probably our most unusual locomotive, and certainly the last tops class locomotive we're going to look at today, is the Class 13. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this particular design, you will recognize that it looks a lot like an 08, but there's two of them and there's quite a bit of modification. You've got that spot on. 3 of these Class 13 locomotives were built and converted from 6 Class 08 locomotives. We have here a dual shunter, one cab controlling both locomotives in what's known as a master and slave formation. So the power unit still remained in the front half of this locomotive. It still was a fully working engine that could provide power. These were built to handle some of the heaviest trains in shunting yards around Sheffield. There was 3 of these locomotives built. You can see there pretty much anywhere they could add extra weight to this locomotive, they did. They had the reinforced buffer beams on these locomotives there too. This adding the ability to handle some of the heavier, the larger trains on the network. So these were some of the most powerful shunting locomotives on the railways. These were given their own separate class as they were quite extensively rebuilt with the controls to operate the separate locomotive there. Although they are 2 separate items, it was classed as one whole locomotive. And we see here both halves of 13003 in use in that British Rail blue livery. These survived right through to the end of the Woodhead route in the early 1980s, after which their purpose wasn't really required anymore, shunting that huge yard there, so these locomotives were scrapped. But it shows you just how ingenious the British Rail engineers can be sometimes to use parts that they already have to build up an unusual but a perfectly suited locomotive design. I'm not aware of a model out there of the Class 13 shunter. It would be something that is very easy indeed to convert from an 08 with a little bit of work. Well, a pair of 08, shall we say, and I have seen some conversions out there at various exhibitions and various different layouts. So if you do fancy giving this a go, maybe it's a little bit of a lockdown project. If you have done a Class 13 for your layout, I'm sure I'd certainly love to see it, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers would do too. So feel free to put a comment in the video there to show your model of the Class 13 if you have done one. So we've come up to the end of the tops classes. I just want to give some honourable mentions for other classes that mainly saw industrial use, but a small amount of them did head into British Rail service, or some models that have been made of locomotives that didn't quite make it to get their own tops classification. The first one of these we're looking at is the brand new Hornby model of the Ruston 88DS. These locos, hundreds of them built for industrial purposes, but a very small amount of these lightweight locomotives also built for parts of the British Rail network where the larger shunters couldn't go. These were purely in departmental use, so not used on revenue earning traffic, just used to shunt engineers' yards and some of the smaller sheds there too. So this is the decorated sample of the forthcoming Hornby model, recently announced as part of their 2021 range. There are 4 liveries coming through. The 2 liveries we're looking at today are the British Rail liveries. So we have here the BR Departmental Green with full lining, and the BR Departmental Blue. This locomotive used in Reading at a sleeper works, I believe. So you can get the model of the 88DS coming through now in 00 gauge. And of course, you can pre-order those today. If you want to find out some more, do follow that link over to the description. I couldn't go without mentioning the Janus Diesel Shunter either. It's not got a huge amount of connections to the British Rail network, but it is a fantastic super detailed model shunter that we've seen come through in 00 gauge, used mainly in industry across different suppliers, such as the National Cobalt that we see here, British Steel, ICI, a lot of different colours. But a small number of these locomotives and the larger Taurus locomotives designs, which had 8 couple wheels rather than 6, were trialled on the British Rail network in the early 1960s in the plain Yorkshire Engine Company green livery. So you can get away with having one of these locomotives in use on your British Rail layout. A very small amount of them were passed to work on the British Rail network too. They were authorised to travel short distances across the network there, maybe to access different collieries or to access the repair sheds for the locomotives. So even though they aren't a British Rail design, you can pick up them and run them on your British Rail layout quite authentically too. This model is one that we have available from Golden Valley Hobbies, produced in partnership with Oxford Rail, and these again are available in several different liveries on our website in 00 gauge right now. I'm not aware of models of these in N or O gauge at the moment, but again, something we can certainly look forward to possibly seeing in the future. One of the most obscure models that we see, but an important part of the story today, is this little locomotive. Some of you may recognize it. Some of you may have never seen it before in your lives. This is a model of a North British shunter, of which there was around 70 built for British Railways in the late 1950s. North British didn't provide a huge amount of diesel shunters. Indeed, they didn't provide a huge amount of diesel locomotives other than some of the Type 2 locomotives later built to British Rail, and they did shortly actually cease to be in the 1960s. So we haven't seen any of these North British designs in our range today, so I really thought it was worth just mentioning this model. It was part of Triang's range in the 1960s, and for its time, it's actually quite an authentic model of these locomotives. So there certainly are some collectors out there who want something a little bit different. You can pick these up when they do come in on our pre-owned listings and add them to your shunter collection. It certainly is something that can be pride of place, a bit more of an unusual design there, but something I wanted to mention that sometimes if you do a little bit of digging, you can find something that you may have never seen before. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope you've enjoyed the roundup of the shunters coming through. We have the full listings for all of these models and even more besides on our website right now. So head over to the link in the description. You'll find all the models available in N gauge, double O gauge and O gauge there too. You can check those out now. There's a lot of shunters I haven't featured here today either, but I've mainly covered the main types of British rail shunters and the shunters that also have fantastic models in many different scales. If there is something you want us to take a closer look at, do leave a comment in the description or get in touch with our customer experience team, who'd be more than happy to help you out there too. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel with many more videos, including our Skillscast sessions, real railway profiles, and our model railway news on there too. We're also featuring that on our Facebook and our website, so don't hesitate to head over there also. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.